Nothing cuts deeper than watching your family walk away and never look back. For 20 years, Astrid has lived with that pain in the ruins of her once proud Viking longhouse. Her children left to chase dreams of glory. Her husband vanished in battle, leaving her to face the world alone. Now 55 and forgotten, she survives in the mountains of Norway by growing small crops and talking to ghosts. Every morning she lights the same fire. Every night she mends the same worn clothes. Life has become simple and quiet and empty. But today something changes. A giant warrior emerges from the forest. Scarred and older, but she knows that face. It's Eirik, her husband, returned from the dead after 2 decades. But when someone you loved abandons you for 20 years, can you ever trust them again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wooden shuttle moved through Astrid's weathered fingers with practiced precision, weaving another row into the tapestry that had occupied her evenings for the past 3 years. Half finished and stretched across the loom her mother had built. The cloth told the story of better days, golden threads depicting the sun over their valley, deep blues for the fjord that once brought traders to their door, rich browns for the earth that had fed 3 generations of her family. She paused, holding the shuttle against her chest, and let her eyes drift to the empty cooking pot hanging over the cold hearth. 20 years ago, that pot had bubbled with stew thick enough to feed a dozen hungry warriors. 20 years ago, voices had filled these halls with laughter and argument, and the comfortable sounds of family life continuing its ancient rhythm. 20 years ago, everything had been different. The night of the raid lived in her memory, with the clarity that only comes from reliving trauma again and again. She had been 35 then, still strong enough to haul water from the stream without stopping to catch her breath. Still young enough to believe that tragedy was something that happened to other families in distant valleys. Eirik had been 42, his beard still more brown than grey, his shoulders broad enough to lift their youngest son Olaf clear off the ground when the boy came running home with scraped knees or exciting discoveries from the forest. Their longhouse had been the pride of the valley. Then, massive oak beams supporting a roof that had weathered 50 winters, carved dragons at the peaks that seemed to breathe in the morning mist, and a great hall where neighboring families gathered for festivals and important decisions. The walls had been thick with prosperity, furs from successful hunts, silver arm rings earned in distant raids, weapons passed down from fathers who had fought alongside kings. Magnus had been 18 that spring, tall like his father, but with Astrid's quick mind and her gift for reading the weather in the shape of clouds. He spent his days practicing with sword and axe, dreaming of the day he would earn his own place in the sagas. Ingrid, 16 and beautiful enough to draw attention from Jarl's sons 3 valleys over, had inherited her mother's skill with the loom and her father's stubborn pride. At 13, little Olaf was the family's surprise, clever with his hands, fascinated by the stars, always carving something from bits of wood or stone. The attack had come without warning, on a night when the spring storms made travel seem impossible. Their enemies had used the weather as cover, creeping through the rain and wind until they were close enough to surround the settlement. Astrid remembered the smell of smoke first, not the clean scent of hearth fires, but the acrid bite of thatch and timber burning where it shouldn't. Then came the screams from their neighbors' homes, the clash of metal on metal, the terrible sound of splintering wood as doors gave way to axes. Eirik had moved with the swift efficiency of a man who had faced death before. While Astrid gathered the children, he armed himself and barricaded the doors. But the raiders were too many and too determined. They wanted more than silver or livestock. They wanted to drive Eirik's clan from the valley entirely, to claim the rich farmland and strategic position for themselves. The fighting had lasted until dawn. When the sun finally burned through the smoke, half the settlement lay in ruins. Eirik's warband had driven off the attackers, but at terrible cost. 7 good men lay dead, including Astrid's brother Bjorn and her father-in-law Gunnar. Their own longhouse had survived, but barely. Scorched beams and shattered shutters bore witness to how close they had come to losing everything. It was in the aftermath, as they buried their dead and counted their losses, that Eirik made the decision that would haunt Astrid for the next 20 years. The raiders would return, he declared. They had tasted defeat, but not destruction, and hungry men always came back for what they couldn't take the first time. The only way to protect the valley, to protect their family, was to strike first, to carry the war to their enemy's home and end the threat permanently. Astrid had argued against it, not because she lacked courage, but because she understood what Eirik in his warrior's pride could not see, that victory in such a war would cost them everything they were fighting to protect. But he was determined, and the other surviving men shared his conviction. They would gather allies from friendly clans, build a force strong enough to crush their enemies completely, and return home to peace. The farewells had been said on a morning when the first snow dusted the mountains. Eirik had held her close, his hands tangled in her hair, promising to return before the winter grew deep. The children had hugged him with the casual confidence of youth. Of course their father would come back. Of course their family would remain whole. Heroes always returned from their quests, but heroes existed only in songs, and songs were lies told to make the truth bearable. For 3 years, Astrid had kept the longhouse running as if Eirik might walk through the door at any moment. She maintained the farm with the children's help, welcomed the occasional traders, and sent what news she could gather through traveling merchants. Word came sporadically. Eirik's war band had joined with allies. They had won victories. They were pursuing their enemies into distant lands. Always the promise that he would return soon, that the war was nearly finished. But as the third winter approached, with no sign of his return, the children began to make their own plans. Magnus left first, driven by 18-year-old impatience and the need to prove himself a man. He couldn't wait for his father's return to begin his own adventures. With his wooden practice sword replaced by sharp steel, he joined a band of young warriors heading north to seek fortune in the rich trading cities beyond the mountains. His last words to Astrid had been a promise to return with treasure enough to rebuild their longhouse in gold and silver. Ingrid lasted 2 more years before the loneliness of the valley became unbearable. A Jarl's son from across the fjord had been courting her through intermediaries, offering marriage and a comfortable life in his father's hall. At 18, with her beauty drawing attention from men both worthy and unworthy, she faced a choice between waiting indefinitely for her father's return or building a life of her own. She chose pragmatism over sentiment, leaving on a spring morning with her wedding finery packed in carved chests and her silver hair ornament gleaming in the sun. Olaf held out the longest. Even at 16, he remained convinced that their family would somehow reunite. But as the years passed and no word came from either his father or siblings, even his optimism began to crack. The final blow came when traders brought news of Magnus, not treasure and glory, but a simple announcement of his death in a failed raid on a fortified town. Their eldest son had died far from home, fighting for strangers, his body unburied and his name unremembered in any song. After that, Olaf's dreams turned away from reunion and toward escape. He had always been fascinated by the stories traders told of lands beyond the Western Sea, green islands where a clever man could build a new life far from the cycles of raid and revenge that consumed the North. When a group of explorers came through seeking young men brave enough to risk unknown waters, Olaf carved himself a navigation stone and sailed away on the morning tide. Astrid had stood alone on the shore, watching the sail disappear into the grey horizon, and finally understood that she had lost her family as surely as if they had all died in the original raid. The house that had once sheltered 3 generations now sheltered only memories and the stubborn refusal of one woman to abandon what remained. The years that followed had tested every skill her mother and grandmother had taught her about survival. She learned to hunt small game when the preserved meat ran low, to identify which roots and berries could sustain life through the lean months, to repair thatch and timber with her own hands when winter storms tore at the weakened structure. She developed the ability to go days without speaking aloud, finding conversation in the wind through the eaves and the crackling of her solitary fire. The loneliness had been the hardest burden. Not the work, she had always been strong and practical, but the silence where laughter should have been, the empty spaces where family should have gathered. She began talking to herself, then to the ghosts of memory, and finally to the very walls that had witnessed her family's happiness. Some nights she would set the table for 5 and eat imaginary meals with imaginary companions, letting herself pretend for an hour that nothing had changed, but pretending had its limits, and reality always reasserted itself with the dawn. The pot remained empty more often than full. The loom gathered dust between projects. The great hall echoed with footsteps that belonged to only one person, growing older and more tired with each passing season. Now, at 55, Astrid had made peace with solitude. Her hair had gone completely silver, braided each morning in the style her mother had taught her. Her hands bore the scars and calluses of decades spent in work that should have been shared among many. Her back ached on cold mornings, and her knees protested when she climbed to repair the roof, but she endured, because endurance was what remained when hope had been exhausted. This morning had begun like all the others of the past several years. She had risen with the sun, checked her small garden for damage from the night's wind, and prepared a simple breakfast of porridge and preserved berries. The empty pot had reminded her, as it did every day, of the meals she would never cook again for the family that would never return. But as she sat at her loom, working threads that would probably never be finished into patterns that would likely never be seen, something changed in the quality of light filtering through the shutters. A shadow passed across the doorway, too large to be one of the local deer, too purposeful to be wind-blown debris. Astrid set down her shuttle and moved to the door with the careful steps of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors in remote places were rarely bearers of good news. Her hand found the handle of the hunting knife at her belt, not because she expected to fight, but because readiness had become habit in a life lived entirely alone. She opened the door, expecting to see a lost traveler, or perhaps one of the traders who occasionally remembered her existence. Instead, she found herself looking up at a figure that belonged more to memory than reality. The man was massive, easily a head taller than anyone she had seen in years, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor and harder living. Scars mapped his face and hands, some old and silver-white, others newer and still pink with healing. His beard was completely grey now, and his hair hung in the style of someone who had learned to cut it himself without benefit of mirrors. His clothes were rough but well made, the garments of a man who understood the value of staying warm and dry. But despite all the changes that 20 years could work on a human body, despite the scars and grey hair and the way his left hand was missing its smallest finger, Astrid knew those eyes. She had looked into them on their wedding day, had seen them crinkle with laughter as he played with their children, had watched them fill with determination as he prepared to leave for a war that was supposed to last only months. "Astrid," Eirik said, and his voice carried the weight of 2 decades spent wondering if this moment would ever come. She stood in the doorway, one hand still gripping the knife she had forgotten she was holding, and felt the careful equilibrium of her solitary life collapse like a roof beam, finally giving way to too much snow. The man she had mourned, raged at, and eventually learned to live without, was standing before her as real as the wind and twice as unexpected. 20 years of questions crowded into her throat, but only one managed to find voice. Why now? Eirik's battle-worn axe hung at his side, its blade nicked and stained with the evidence of countless conflicts. He shifted the weapon's weight as he looked at his wife, former wife perhaps, after so many years, and searched for words that could bridge 2 decades of absence. "I tried to come back sooner," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered. Every day for 20 years I tried. Astrid stepped back from the doorway, but didn't invite him in. The knife remained in her hand, not raised in threat, but present as a reminder that she had learned to protect herself in ways she never needed to when he was young and strong and present. 20 years. Eirik. Her voice carried the flat tone of someone who had practiced this conversation in her mind countless times, never believing it would actually happen. I raised our children alone. I watched them leave one by one because their father never came home. I buried my hope so deep I thought it was dead. He nodded slowly, as if he had expected this reception. His scarred hands hung loose at his sides, empty of any gesture that might bridge the gulf between them. Magnus is dead. The words came out sharp enough to cut. 3 years now. Died fighting strangers for a cause that wasn't his, in a place whose name I don't even know. No burial, no songs, no one to bring word home except a trader who mentioned it like he was discussing the weather. The impact of her words hit him like a physical blow. She watched his face crumble, watched 20 years of imagined reunions with his eldest son die in a single moment. His hand moved unconsciously to his axe handle, not for violence, but for the comfort of familiar weight. "Ingrid?" he asked, though she could see he feared the answer. "Married. Gone 5 years now to a Jarl's hall across the fjord. She has children of her own, a life you've never seen. She stopped asking about you after the first few years. And Olaf sailed west with explorers 2 years ago. Said he wanted to see the lands beyond the edge of the world." Astrid's voice softened slightly. He carved himself a navigation stone before he left. Still had hope, that one. Said maybe he'd find something worth coming home to tell us about. Eirik absorbed each loss like a sword thrust. She could see him calculating the years, trying to understand how his children had grown up and moved on while he was... where? What had kept him away so long that his family had dissolved like morning mist? "I was captured," he said finally, "after the first winter of fighting. We pursued our enemies too far, got separated from our allies. I was taken alive, captured." The word tasted bitter in her mouth. "For 20 years? 15. He lifted his damaged hand, showing where the missing finger had been crudely severed. "Slave labor in the quarries south of the Great Mountains. They kept us alive to work, killed us if we tried to escape. I tried anyway twice. Lost the finger the second time." She studied his scarred face, the lean hardness that spoke of inadequate food and constant labor. If he was lying, it was a lie written in flesh and bone. And the other 5 years. Looking for home. The mountains had changed. Landslides, new streams, settlements abandoned or moved. I followed false leads, asked questions of people who remembered different names for places. Twice I was sure I'd found the right valley, only to discover strangers' graves where I expected to find family. Despite herself, despite the anger she had cultivated like a garden for 20 years, Astrid felt something crack inside her chest. The practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive through winters that should have killed her, recognized truth when she heard it. "You could have sent word," she said, but the accusation lacked the fire it had carried moments before. "How?" "I was property, Astrid. Property doesn't send messages home." They stood in silence, the weight of lost decades settling between them like snow that falls too fast to melt. She noticed details now that shock had initially hidden. The way he favored his left leg, the careful way he held his shoulders, the hollowness around his eyes that spoke of losses beyond just family. "The house," he said, looking past her at the sagging timbers and patched walls. "It's falling down?" "Yes, turns out one woman can't maintain what 3 generations of men built. I've done what I could." She watched him take in the evidence of her struggle, the gaps in the thatch, the shutters hanging crooked on broken hinges, the general air of proud decay that had settled over what was once the finest hall in the valley. His warrior's eyes catalogued structural problems with the same efficiency he had once used to assess enemy positions. "I could help," he offered. If you'd let me." The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was ready to address directly. Help meant staying. Staying meant admitting he belonged here. Belonging meant confronting 20 years of accumulated hurt. Why should I? The words came out harder than she intended. You left once. What happens when you decide to leave again? I won't. You don't know that. You thought you'd be back in months the first time. He nodded, accepting the truth of her doubt. You're right. I can't promise what I don't control, but I can tell you that I've spent 20 years trying to get back to this place, to you. I can tell you that I'm older now, too old for the kind of glory that called me away before. I can tell you that I have nowhere else to go and no one else to be. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not the vigorous warrior who had left her bed 20 years ago, but a man who had been broken and reforged into something different. The scars weren't just on his skin. They were in the careful way he stood, the measured way he spoke, the humility that had replaced the fierce pride she remembered. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to be married to a stranger. We're both strangers now, he said. Maybe we can learn each other again. The simplicity of the suggestion caught her off guard. Not a declaration of undying love, not a demand for immediate forgiveness. Just the practical acknowledgement that they were different people who would need to discover whether they could build something new from the ruins of what they had. Lost? You can sleep in the storage room, she said finally. There's straw for bedding and it's dry. But Eirik, she met his eyes directly. I won't be anyone's consolation prize. If you stay, it's because you choose to be here, not because you have nowhere else to go. I understand. And if you leave again, don't come back. I won't survive hoping twice, he nodded gravely. I understand that too. She stepped aside then, allowing him to cross the threshold into what had once been his home. As he passed, she caught his scent, leather and wood smoke, and something indefinably masculine that memory recognized even when her mind insisted on caution. The great hall seemed smaller with him in it, but also somehow more complete. For 20 years, the space had been too large for one person. Now it felt properly proportioned again, as if it had been waiting for his return to remember its true dimensions. Are you hungry? She asked, falling back on the ancient hospitality that had been bred into her bones. Always, he said. And something in the way he said it made her think he wasn't just talking about food. She moved to the kitchen area, grateful for familiar tasks that would give her hands something to do while her mind processed this impossible development. As she prepared a simple meal from her limited stores, she was acutely aware of him standing awkwardly in the center of the room. A man trying to find his place in a space that had once been his kingdom. 20 years ago, he would have settled into his chair by the fire, called for ale, and filled the room with stories of his day's activities. Now he waited for permission to sit, uncertain of his welcome, careful not to assume privileges that might no longer be his. Sit, she told him, nodding toward the bench by the table. You look ready to fall over. He sat with visible relief, and she realized he was probably exhausted from whatever journey had brought him here. As she ladled thin soup into wooden bowls, she found herself wondering how far he had traveled, how long he had been walking, whether he had been as nervous about this moment as she was. The soup is simple, she said, setting a bowl before him. I don't cook for guests anymore. It smells like paradise, he said. And the gratitude in his voice was so profound that she had to look away. They ate in silence, the sound of spoons against wood loud in the quiet hall. She watched him eat with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned not to waste food, who had known real hunger and didn't take sustenance for granted. When he was finished, he sat back and looked at her across the table that had once hosted their entire family. Thank you, he said, for the soup. For not barring the door, she nodded, acknowledging the truth that they both understood, that she could have refused him entry, could have turned away the ghost of her former life and continued in the solitude she had learned to navigate. The fact that she hadn't was a gift neither of them had dared to expect. We'll start with tonight, she said. Tomorrow we'll see what tomorrow brings. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. After 20 years of endings, Perhaps that was enough. The wooden sword lay forgotten in the corner where Magnus had left it 18 years ago, its carved edges worn smooth by countless hours of practice. Astrid found herself staring at it as she prepared breakfast the morning after Eirik's return. Memories flooding back unbidden. Magnus had been 7 when Eirik carved that sword. Small for his age, but fierce in his determination to become a warrior like his father. Every morning he would wake before dawn to practice his forms in the yard, his young voice calling out the names of the strikes Eirik had taught him. Shield Splitter, Dragon's Tooth, Skull Breaker. The wooden blade would whistle through the air as he fought imaginary enemies, always emerging victorious in battles that existed only in his mind. She could still see him on the morning he left, no longer a boy playing with wooden toys, but a young man with real steel at his side and dreams of glory burning in his eyes. He had hugged her goodbye with the casual confidence of youth, promising to return with treasure enough to rebuild their longhouse in silver and gold. "I'll come back a hero, Mother," he had said. "You'll see, the skalds will sing songs about Magnus Eiriksson, and you'll be proud." Now the wooden sword gathered dust while its owner lay dead in a foreign field, unsung and unmourned, except by the mother who would never stop loving the boy who had dreamed of greatness. "You're thinking about him." Eirik's voice came from behind her, gentle and understanding. She turned to find him standing in the doorway that separated the storage room from the main hall, his hair damp from washing in the cold water she had left for him. "I think about all of them," she said, setting down the wooden bowl she had been holding. "Every day." He nodded and moved closer, his eyes finding the wooden sword. He made that sing like a real blade. Even as a child, he had the instincts. "You remember." "I remember everything." Eirik picked up the sword, testing its weight and balance. "He would have been a fine warrior." "He was a fine warrior. That's why he's dead." The words came out more bitter than she intended, but she didn't apologize for them. Magnus had indeed become skilled with weapons, skilled enough to attract the attention of war bands that needed young men willing to die for other people's causes. His competence had killed him as surely as any enemy's blade. Eirik set the sword down carefully, respectfully, as if it were a grave marker rather than a child's toy. "Tell me about when he left." She studied his face, looking for signs of the judgment or regret that might make this conversation impossible. Instead, she found only the patient attention of someone who genuinely wanted to understand what he had missed. "He waited 3 years for you to come home," she said finally. 3 years of practicing with that sword and asking every trader if they had news of Eirik Thorson's warband. "He helped me maintain the farm, but his heart was never in it. He wanted adventure, wanted to prove himself. Worthy of the family name. He was worthy from the day he was born. Try telling that to an 18-year-old boy whose father went off to win glory and never returned." She moved to the hearth, stirring the porridge that would serve as their breakfast. When Bjorn Eriksson came through recruiting for a raid on the trading towns up north, Magnus saw his chance. Said he was tired of waiting for heroes to come home when he could go out and become one himself. Eirik was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what she was telling him. His absence hadn't just left them unprotected. It had driven his son to seek elsewhere the validation and purpose that should have come from his father. "What did you tell him?" "What could I tell him? That he should stay home and help his mother tend vegetables while other young men went out to win fame and fortune. That he should ignore the call in his blood because his father had failed to answer it." She shook her head. "I told him to be careful. I told him to remember that dead heroes are still dead, no matter how good the songs sound. I told him to come home, but he didn't. Oh, he meant to. They always mean to." Astrid ladled porridge into 2 bowls, the domestic task giving her hands something to do while she navigated the painful territory of memory. The first raid went well. He came back with silver arm rings and stories of how the town guards fled before their charge. He was so proud, so certain that he had found his calling. When did it change? The winter after you left. Word came that the northern trading towns had banded together, hired professional soldiers to protect their wealth. What had been easy pickings became serious warfare. Magnus's band took heavy losses, but he survived and came home with scars he wore like badges of honor. She handed him a bowl, noting how carefully he accepted it, as if even this simple exchange required negotiation between them. The third raid was the one that killed him. Bjorn convinced the young men that one big strike would set them up for life, a fortress town that supposedly contained the treasury of 3 kings. Magnus knew it was dangerous, but by then he had a reputation to maintain. The other warriors looked up to him, called him Magnus the Bold. He was bold, Eirik said softly. Sometimes I think I should have taught him more caution. Sometimes I think you should have been there to teach him anything at all. The accusation hung between them like smoke, and she immediately regretted it. This was not about assigning blame for decisions that couldn't be changed. It was about understanding how their family had come apart in his absence. "I'm sorry," she said. "That wasn't fair." It was true. Fair and true aren't always the same thing. His acceptance of her anger surprised her. The Eirik she remembered would have defended himself, would have listed all the reasons why his duty to the clan had required his absence. This older version seemed to understand that explanations, however valid, couldn't resurrect the dead or undo 20 years of consequence. They ate their simple breakfast in thoughtful silence, each lost in memories of the boy who had once filled this hall with laughter and wooden sword battles. When the meal was finished, Eirik stood and moved toward the door. "Where are you going?" Astrid asked, "To look at the roof. Those loose timbers won't fix themselves." She watched him go, noting how he moved with purpose despite his injuries, how he seemed to draw energy from having useful work to do. Through the window, she could see him examining the damaged sections with the practiced eye of someone who understood construction. Without asking permission, he began making repairs, small ones at first, tightening loose boards and clearing debris from the gutters. She found herself simultaneously grateful for the help and resentful of his assumption that he had the right to alter her home without consultation. By midday, he had accomplished more than she typically managed in a week. The roof no longer leaked in 3 places. The shutters hung properly on their hinges, and the front door closed without the careful lifting and wiggling she had learned to perform automatically. "You didn't have to do all that," she said when he came inside for the noon meal. "Didn't I? A man has to earn his keep somehow. You're not my hired hand, Eirik. Then what am I?" The question caught her off guard. What was he exactly? Not quite a husband after 20 years apart. Not quite a stranger despite their shared history. Not quite welcome, but not entirely unwelcome either. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then maybe we figure it out as we go." He spoke with the calm patience of someone who had learned to accept uncertainty, to build on whatever foundation was available, rather than demanding solid ground before taking the first step. It was a quality she didn't remember in the younger man, and she found herself wondering what else the years had taught him. "The roof looks good," she said finally. "It'll hold through winter now. Maybe longer if we can get some proper thatch to replace those worn sections." The casual use of "we" didn't escape her notice, but she chose not to challenge it. For now, having another pair of hands, skilled hands that remembered how things should be, built, felt like a luxury she had forgotten. She could want. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for letting me help." As afternoon moved toward evening, they settled into a careful routine, she preparing the evening meal while he continued working on small repairs. Both of them navigating the strange territory of shared space with the caution of diplomats from rival kingdoms. But when she called him to dinner, and he came immediately, setting aside his tools with the automatic response of long habit, she caught a glimpse of how they might learn to live together again. Different than before, marked by loss and caution, but perhaps not impossible. "Tomorrow I'll show you the garden," she said as they finished eating. "I'd like that." It was a small promise, but it pointed toward a future that extended beyond tonight, beyond the immediate crisis of his return. For the first time since he had appeared at her door, Astrid allowed herself to consider the possibility that this strange new arrangement might actually work. The silver wedding braid lay coiled in Astrid's palm like a sleeping serpent, its delicate threads still holding their shape despite years of careful storage. She had found it while searching for extra blankets in the chest where she kept her most precious belongings, items too valuable to use but too meaningful to discard. A week had passed since Eirik's return, and they had begun to establish a rhythm that felt almost natural. He worked on repairs during the day while she tended to cooking and the small tasks that kept their reduced household functioning. They shared meals and occasional conversation, but still slept in separate rooms, still moved around each other with the careful politeness of strangers sharing an inn. "Ingrid wore this on her wedding day," Astrid said, holding up the braid as Eirik entered from his morning inspection of the animal pen. "Took me 3 days to weave all the silver wire through her hair." Eirik set down his tools and moved closer, his eyes focusing on the intricate metalwork. "She was beautiful that day, like sunlight on water. You remember her wedding?" "No," he said quietly. "I missed it. But I remember her at 16, and I can imagine how she must have looked." The admission hung between them, another milestone in their children's lives that his absence had cost him. Astrid had grown accustomed to bearing these moments alone, but somehow speaking them aloud to him made the losses feel fresh again. "The Jarl's son was a good match," she said, settling into the details as a way of sharing what he had missed. "Handsome, wealthy, kind enough in his way. He gave her a bride price that could have fed this valley for a year, but he wasn't the boy she had dreamed of marrying when she was 12 and thought love was the only thing that mattered." Astrid ran her fingers over the silver threads. "She came to me the night before the ceremony, crying because she felt like she was betraying some promise she had made to herself." Eirik sat down across from her, giving the conversation the attention it deserved. "What did you tell her?" "That dreams change when we do. That the girl who believed in fairy tales had grown into a woman who understood that security and kindness were their own form of love." Astrid smiled at the memory. "I told her that her father would have been proud to see her make such a sensible choice. Would I have been?" The question surprised her with its vulnerability. The Eirik she had married would never have doubted his own judgment about such matters, would have assumed that his opinion would naturally align with practical wisdom. "I don't know," she said honestly. "The man who left here might have wanted her to wait for a great romance, some warrior who would sweep her off her feet with grand gestures and passionate declarations. But that man never had to watch his daughter grow tired of waiting for heroes who don't come home." He nodded slowly, absorbing the implication. "You think I would have been too proud to accept a practical marriage? I think you would have been too in love with the idea of your daughter as a princess in a saga to see her as a woman who needed to build a real life." It was perhaps the most direct criticism she had offered since his return, but he received it without defensiveness. Instead, he seemed to be measuring it against some internal standard she couldn't see. "You're probably right," he said finally. "I was full of grand ideas about how life should be lived. Took slavery to teach me the difference between stories and survival." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the silver braid catching the morning light between them. Astrid found herself studying his hands, scarred now, missing the finger, but still graceful in their movements. She remembered those hands braiding Ingrid's hair when their daughter was small, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle as he wove flowers into the golden strands. "I still braid my hair every morning," she said, surprising herself with the confession, I noticed. Force of habit, I suppose. "My mother always said a woman's hair was her crown, that how she wore it told the world what she thought of herself. And what does yours say?" She considered the question seriously, thinking about the careful plaits she wove each dawn, the way she still took pride in keeping them neat, despite having no one to see them but herself. "That I'm still here. That I still remember who I was, even if I'm not her anymore. You're still beautiful, Astrid." The words came so quietly she might have missed them if she hadn't been watching his face. There was no calculation in the compliment, no attempt at seduction, just the simple observation of a man who had been looking at her carefully for a week and wanted her to know what he saw. I'm 55 years old. Eirik, beautiful is for young women who haven't spent 20 years learning how to survive alone. Beautiful is for women who know what they're worth. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, not the flush of youth, but something deeper and more complicated. When had anyone last looked at her as a woman rather than simply a survivor? When had she last allowed herself to care what anyone thought of her appearance? We should talk about the future, she said, deflecting from territory that felt too dangerous to navigate. About what happens when winter comes, about whether this arrangement can really work. What do you want to happen? I want to know that you won't leave. The words came out more raw than she intended. I want to know that if I let myself get used to having you here, you won't decide in 6 months that you're restless for adventure again. I told you. You told me you're too old for glory. But what about when spring comes and the traders start talking about opportunities in distant lands? What about when some young warrior comes through looking for an experienced man to lead a raid? What about when this quiet life starts feeling like a trap instead of a refuge? He was quiet for a long time, considering her fears with the seriousness they deserved. She appreciated that he didn't offer immediate reassurances, didn't dismiss her concerns as groundless worry. I can't promise I'll never be tempted, he said finally. 20 years of war and slavery didn't kill the part of me that responds to challenges. But I can promise that I understand what I lost the last time I chose adventure over family. I can promise that I've learned the difference between proving myself to strangers and building something that matters with people I love. People you love? Did you think I came back just for the hospitality? The question was gentle but direct, forcing her to acknowledge what they had both been dancing around for a week. He hadn't returned to an empty house seeking shelter. He had returned to her specifically and intentionally. I don't know how to love someone again, she admitted. I don't know if I remember how to trust someone with my heart. We'll figure it out. What if we can't? What if too much has changed, too much has been lost? Then we'll know we tried. But Astrid! He reached across the table and touched her hand, the first deliberate physical contact since his return. I didn't spend 5 years searching for this. Valley, just to give up now because it's difficult. His touch was warm and rough and familiar, in ways that made her chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to name. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean into it either. I need time, she said. I know, and I need you to understand that this isn't the same as it was before. We're not the same people we were. I know that too. She studied his face, looking for signs of impatience or expectation, but found only the steady presence of someone prepared to let things develop at whatever pace they would. All right then, she said. We'll see what happens. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it wasn't a rejection either. It was the careful acknowledgement that something worth exploring might be possible between them, given time and patience and the kind of mature wisdom that could only come from having lost everything once and learned to value what remained. As evening approached and they prepared their simple meal together, Astrid found herself watching how Eirik moved through the space that was slowly becoming theirs rather than just hers. He was learning where things belonged, offering help without being asked, settling into domestic rhythms with an ease that surprised her. Maybe, she thought, as she watched him tend the fire with competent hands, maybe they could build something new from the ashes of what they had lost. Maybe love at 55 was different from love at 35, less passionate perhaps, but deeper and more durable. Maybe it was enough that he had come home. The navigation stone felt warm in Astrid's palm, despite the morning chill. Olaf had carved it himself during the long winter before his departure, spending countless evenings by the fire, shaping the smooth river rock with careful precision. The surface bore the 8-pointed star that marked true north, surrounded by smaller symbols representing wind directions, seasonal stars, and the landmarks that could guide a traveler home. He was always the clever one, Astrid said, offering the stone to Eirik as they stood together in the rebuilt doorway. 2 weeks had passed since his return, and the longhouse bore witness to their growing partnership. New thatch on the roof, straightened walls, and windows that no longer let in winter drafts. Eirik turned the stone over in his scarred hands, reading the symbols with the appreciation of someone who understood their value. Even as a boy, he saw patterns where the rest of us saw chaos. Remember how he could predict the weather by watching the way birds flew. I remember. She smiled at the memory of their youngest son, at 8 years old, standing in the yard with his arms spread wide, claiming he could feel storm winds in his bones 3 days before they arrived. Magnus called it witchcraft. Ingrid said it was just luck. But you and I knew better. He had a gift for seeing what others missed. Eirik handed the stone back to her. What did he say when he left? Astrid closed her fingers around the carved rock, feeling the familiar indentations that marked her son's careful work. That the world was bigger than our valley, and he wanted to know what lay beyond the edges of every map he'd ever seen. He'd heard traders talking about green lands across the western sea, places where a clever man could claim rich soil just by having the courage to sail toward the sunset. He was 13 when I left. I thought I'd have years to teach him the things a father should pass on. He taught himself most of what he needed to know. She tucked the stone into her belt pouch, keeping it close, as she always did. He learned to read the stars from an old trader who wintered with us one year, practiced carving on every piece of wood he could find. By the time he was 16, he could navigate better than men twice his age. They walked together toward the small garden plot where Astrid had coaxed vegetables from reluctant soil for 20 years. Working side by side had become natural during these past 2 weeks, she directing, he providing the strength for heavier tasks. Both of them discovering how much easier shared labor made everything. The morning he left, he gave me this stone, she continued as they began checking the last harvest before winter's arrival. Said it would help me find my way if I ever got lost. I told him I wasn't planning to go anywhere, and he laughed. Said getting lost wasn't always about wandering away from home. Eirik paused in his examination of the turnip bed. What did he mean? I think he saw that I was already lost, even though I was standing in my own garden. Lost in grief for you, lost in worry about what would happen to our family. He was trying to give me something to hold on to, some way to find my direction again. The admission surprised her. She hadn't consciously understood Olaf's gift at the time, had seen it simply as a sweet gesture from a son to his mother. But now, with Eirik beside her and the navigation stone warm against her hip, she recognized the deeper wisdom in her youngest child's farewell. Have you? Eirik asked quietly. Found your direction again? She considered the question as she pulled the last carrots from the dark earth. The woman who had been left alone 20 years ago had indeed been lost, confused about how to continue living when the structure of her life had collapsed. But the woman kneeling in this garden, with soil under her fingernails and a returned husband working beside her, was something different. Not the same person who had been abandoned, but not entirely someone new either. I'm beginning to, she said finally. They worked in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, filling baskets with the vegetables that would see them through the cold months ahead. Astrid found herself stealing glances at Eirik as he moved through tasks that required no discussion. She would point to a plant ready for harvest, and his hands would be there to dig or pull or cut with the efficiency of someone who understood both the work and her preferred methods. When they finally straightened, backs aching and baskets full, she realized they had accomplished more in one morning than she typically managed in 3 days alone. The practical advantages of partnership were undeniable, but something deeper was at work as well. They were learning to anticipate each other's needs, to work as a team rather than two individuals sharing space. We should preserve these today, she said, surveying their harvest. The weather won't hold much longer. Show me how you want it done. The simple offer meant more than he probably realized. The Eirik she had married would have assumed he knew the best methods, would have taken charge of food preservation, with the confidence of someone who had never spent a winter wondering if supplies would last. This older version asked for instruction. acknowledged her expertise in matters of survival. They spent the afternoon working over steaming pots and drying racks, preparing vegetables for storage with the careful attention that could mean the difference between comfort and hunger during the dark months ahead. As they worked, their bodies developed a rhythm, she chopping and seasoning while he lifted heavy pots and stirred contents that would have strained her shoulders. It was during these domestic tasks that their first real moment of physical intimacy occurred. Reaching for the same ladle, their hands brushed and lingered, fingers intertwining for just a moment longer than necessity required. The touch sent warmth up her arm that had nothing to do with the heat from the cooking fire. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she remembered from their early marriage. Not the desperate passion of youth, but something deeper and more patient. The look of a man who saw beauty in the everyday moments of shared labor, who found satisfaction in building something together rather than conquering something alone. "Astrid," he said quietly, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. "I know. I don't want to rush anything. I don't want to assume. I know that too." But she didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she let herself feel the warmth of his touch, the calluses that spoke of hard work, the slight tremor that suggested he was as affected by the contact as she was. When they finally separated, she to check the drying vegetables, he to bank the cooking fire, the air between them hummed with possibilities that hadn't existed the week before. They were still taking things slowly, still sleeping in separate rooms, still approaching each other with the caution of people who had learned that love could disappear without warning. But something was shifting, some barrier was thinning. That evening, as they shared their simple meal by the rebuilt hearth, Astrid found herself studying Eirik's profile in the firelight. The harsh angles that slavery had carved into his face were softening with regular meals and peaceful sleep. The wariness in his eyes was giving way to something that looked like contentment. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, catching her stare. "About Olaf's navigation stone, about finding direction, and wondering if maybe the path forward doesn't always lead away from where you've been. Sometimes it circles back, but to a different place than where you started." He nodded slowly, understanding the metaphor. They weren't trying to recreate their young marriage. They were building something new from the people they had become, different than what they had lost, but perhaps no less valuable. "I'd like to see those green lands someday," he said. "The ones Olaf sailed toward." "You want to leave again?" The words came out sharper than she intended, old fears rising, despite their growing closeness. "I want to see them with you. When spring comes, when the traveling season opens, I want us to look for our son together." The suggestion caught her completely off guard. She had assumed that if Eirik stayed, it would mean accepting that their scattered family would remain scattered. The possibility of actively seeking reunion had never occurred to her. "That's impossible," she said automatically. "We don't know where he is, or even if he's still alive. We know he sailed west. We know he was injured and couldn't return on his own. We know there are settlements where travelers gather before attempting ocean crossings." Eirik leaned forward, his voice gaining the intensity of someone who had been thinking about this for days. "We could find him, Astrid. We could bring him home. And leave this place again? Risk losing everything we've rebuilt? Take it with us. Home isn't the house, home is the family." The idea was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. To abandon the security of familiar walls, to risk the unknown in pursuit of a son who might not want to be found, it went against every survival instinct she had developed during 20 years of careful self-preservation. But as she looked at Eirik's face, saw the hope burning there like a banked fire, she felt something stir in her chest that she had thought was dead. The part of her that had once been brave enough to love completely, to risk everything for the chance of happiness. "We'll think about it," she said finally. "When winter passes and we know this," she gestured between them, "can survive the testing time." "When winter passes," he agreed. It was a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely, but it pointed toward a future that extended beyond mere survival. For the first time since his return, they were making plans together that reached beyond the next meal, the next day. the next small crisis requiring attention. As they prepared for sleep in their separate rooms, Astrid clutched Olaf's navigation stone and allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to choose adventure over safety, to trust that love could be strong enough to weather whatever storms they might encounter on the path toward finding their son. Maybe finding direction didn't always mean staying where you were safe. Maybe sometimes it meant having the courage to venture into unknown territory, guided by nothing but hope and the hand of someone who promised not to let you get lost alone. 3 weeks had passed since Eirik's return, and Astrid had finally brought out the horn for their evening meal. For 20 years she had drunk from it alone each night, a ritual that connected her to memories of family gatherings when the great hall had echoed with voices and laughter. Tonight, for the first time since his departure, she shared it with someone else. "My grandfather carved this," she said, running her finger along the twisted dragon that formed the horn's main decoration. "He said every family needed something that remembered all the joy it had witnessed." Eirik accepted the horn when she passed it to him, drinking deeply before studying the intricate patterns. "I remember your grandfather working on it. Took him an entire winter, carving by firelight while he told stories about the old kings. You were so young then." "I'm surprised you remember." "I remember because it was the first time I realized that some things were worth the patience to make them perfect." He traced the dragon's scales with his thumb. "Like building a marriage, like raising children, like learning to love someone for a lifetime instead of just a season." The words carried weight that went beyond simple reminiscence. They were talking about the horn, but they were also talking about themselves, about whether love could survive being cracked, whether it could still hold what mattered even after damage. "The crack happened during the raid," Astrid said, pointing to the thin line that marred the otherwise perfect carving. "I thought it was ruined, that I'd have to throw it away, but you didn't." But I didn't. I discovered that cracked things can still be useful, still be beautiful in their own way. Sometimes the damage becomes part of the story instead of the end of it. They sat in comfortable silence, passing the horn back and forth as they shared the simple stew that had become their standard evening meal. The domesticity of the moment struck Astrid as remarkable, not because it was extraordinary, but because it felt so natural after weeks of careful navigation around each other. "We need to talk about the future," Eirik said eventually, his voice carrying the weight of decisions too long postponed. "About what happens when winter truly sets in, about whether this arrangement we've built can survive being tested." Astrid set down her wooden spoon and gave him her full attention. They had been dancing around this conversation for days, both of them aware that the relative ease of autumn weather had allowed them to avoid addressing deeper questions about their relationship. "What do you want to happen?" she asked. "I want to stay, not just through winter but permanently. I want to rebuild what we lost and create something new from what remains." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to be your husband again, Astrid. Not the man I was 20 years ago, but the man I am now." The declaration hung between them like a bridge she could choose to cross or burn. She had known this moment was coming, had felt it building in the small intimacies of shared work and careful touches, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that forced decision. "What if I can't?" she said quietly. "What if 20 years of learning to survive alone has changed me too much? What if I don't know how to be anyone's wife anymore? Then we'll learn together. We'll make mistakes and figure out how to fix them. We'll build something that works for who we are now, not who we used to be. And if it doesn't work, if we discover that we're too different, that too much has been lost, then at least we'll know we tried with everything we had." Eirik reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "But Astrid, I didn't spend 5 years searching for this valley just to give up at the first sign of difficulty. I didn't survive 20 years of slavery and wandering just to settle for being a helpful stranger in my own home." His words carried the quiet intensity of someone who had thought deeply about what he was asking, who understood both the risks and the potential rewards. This wasn't the impulsive passion of youth. This was the considered decision, of a man who had learned to value what truly mattered. "I need you to understand something," Astrid said, turning her hand palm up beneath his so their fingers could intertwine. "I'm not the woman you married. That woman was softer, more trusting, more willing to believe that love could conquer any obstacle. This woman has learned that love isn't enough by itself. It needs to be supported by commitment and choice, and the daily decision to keep building something together. No, I've learned to protect myself. Eirik, I've learned to expect disappointment and prepare for loss. I won't go back to being someone who gives everything without reservation. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to give what you can, when you can, and trust that I'll do the same." She studied his face in the flickering firelight, looking for signs of the restlessness or pride that had driven him away before. Instead, she found the patient steadiness of someone who had been broken and rebuilt, who understood that lasting things were built slowly and carefully, rather than seized in moments of passion. "What about your wandering feet?" she asked. "What about when spring comes and the world opens up again? What about when staying here starts to feel like giving up instead of choosing contentment? What about when you wake up one morning and realize you've let someone close enough to hurt you again?" He countered. "What about when your fear of abandonment makes you push away the very thing you want most?" The question stopped her short. He was right. She had been so focused on his potential for leaving that she hadn't examined her own capacity for self-sabotage. 20 years of solitude had taught her to be self-reliant, but they had also taught her to be afraid of vulnerability. "We're both risks to each other," she said. "Recognizing the truth of it, yes, but maybe that's what makes it worth trying." A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters, reminding them that winter was approaching fast. Soon, they would be confined together in close quarters for months, dependent on each other for everything from conversation to survival. If they were going to make this work, they needed to commit fully rather than continuing to test the waters. "All right," she said, the words coming out steadier than she felt. "Let's try." "Try what exactly?" "Being married again, being partners instead of just housemates, sharing a bed and a life, and whatever future we can build together." The relief that crossed his face was so profound that she realized how much courage it had taken for him to ask. How much he had been risking in pushing for this decision. "Are you sure?" "No, but I'm tired of being afraid of my own life." She lifted the cracked drinking horn and offered it to him. "To making new vows with old hearts." He accepted the horn and drank, then passed it back to her. "To love that's strong enough to survive being broken." She drank as well, tasting not just the ale, but the symbolism of the moment. They were choosing each other deliberately, as adults who understood the costs and complications of love. This wasn't the fairy tale romance of their youth. It was something more durable and more real. That night, for the first time since his return, Eirik didn't retreat to the storage room when the meal was finished. Instead, he helped her bank the fire and secure the shutters, moving through the evening routine as if he belonged there permanently. When she led him to the bedchamber they had once shared, her heart hammered with nervousness that had nothing to do with inexperience and everything to do with the vulnerability of letting someone close enough to matter again. "We don't have to," he began, but she silenced him with a touch. I want to remember what it feels like to sleep beside someone who chose to stay." They came together slowly, carefully, with the reverence of people who understood that physical intimacy was just one expression of the trust they were rebuilding. Their bodies were older, marked by time and hardship, but the connection between them felt both familiar and entirely new. Afterward, as they lay entwined in the darkness with winter wind howling around their repaired home, Astrid felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years, the deep security of being completely known and completely accepted by another person. "No regrets?" Eirik asked quietly. "Not yet. When you have them, because you will, tell me. We'll work through them together." She nestled closer to his warmth, marveling at how quickly her body remembered the comfort of shared sleep. "What if this is the easy part? What if winter brings out all the ways we've changed? all the incompatibilities we haven't discovered yet. Then we'll face them as they come, one day at a time, one problem at a time, one choice at a time. It was a practical answer rather than a romantic one, but it satisfied her more than grand declarations would have. They were building something real and sustainable rather than just indulging in sentiment about what they had once shared, as sleep claimed. Her in the arms of the husband she had mourned and released and somehow found again. Astrid's last conscious thought was about the navigation stone in her belt pouch. Olaf had been right. She had been lost, even while standing in familiar territory. But perhaps finding your way home wasn't always about returning to where you started. Sometimes it was about recognizing that home could be rebuilt in the same place, with the same person, but as something entirely new. The trader's message stick felt heavier than its size warranted, carved with symbols that would change everything Astrid thought she knew about her scattered family. Bjorn, the far-traveled, had arrived that morning with his pack mules and weathered face, bringing news from the wider world that had barely touched their isolated valley for months. A month had passed since she and Eirik had committed to rebuilding their marriage, and the rhythm they had established felt as natural as breathing. Their days began with shared breakfast and morning repairs, continued through afternoon tasks that required both their skills, and ended with evening meals and the comfortable intimacy of two people learning to love each other again. But Bjorn's arrival shattered their peaceful routine like a stone through ice. News travels slow to these remote places, the trader said, settling his bulk onto the bench by their table. But some stories are important enough to carry, no matter how far off the beaten path they take you. Astrid poured ale for their unexpected guest, while Eirik studied the carved symbols on the message stick with growing concern. The marks indicated urgent news about family members, information that someone had paid good silver to ensure reached its destination. "Ingrid," Bjorn said without preamble, his weathered face grave. "Your daughter is not living the comfortable life you imagined." The words hit Astrid like a physical blow. For 5 years, she had comforted herself with the belief that at least one of her children had found happiness, that Ingrid's practical marriage had provided the security and contentment that her brother's adventures had failed to deliver. "Tell us," Eirik said, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone preparing for battle. "Her husband died 2 years ago in a hunting accident, gored by a wild boar while trying to impress his father-in-law with his courage." Bjorn accepted the ale Astrid offered with a nod of thanks. "Left her with 2 young children and no inheritance except what his family chose to allow. His family provides for her," Astrid said, clinging to hope even as she felt it slipping away. "Surely they wouldn't abandon their son's widow and their own grandchildren. His family blames her for his death. Say she brought bad luck to their bloodline, that her foreign ways corrupted their son's judgment." The trader's expression grew darker. "They've taken everything that was rightfully hers. The bride price, the household goods, even the jewelry her husband gave her. She lives now in a servant's hut with barely enough food for the children." Eirik's hand found hers across the table, his touch grounding her as the world tilted around this new reality. Their daughter, their beautiful, a practical daughter who had chosen security over romance, was trapped in a situation that made Astrid's 20 years of solitude seem luxurious by comparison. "There's more," Bjorn continued, and his reluctance to share additional details told them that worse news was coming. "They're pressuring her to marry the dead husband's cousin, a man known for his cruel treatment of women. She's resisting, but she has no family to support her, no resources to leave. They're making it clear that cooperation is the only way to ensure her children are fed." "My grandbabies," Astrid whispered, the words coming out broken. She had never met these children, had only heard of their existence through occasional trader reports. But the thought of them hungry and frightened while she lived in relative comfort made her feel physically sick. "How old are the children?" Eirik asked, his tactical mind already working on the practical aspects of the situation. "Boy of 8, girl of 5. Old enough to understand that their mother is powerless. Young enough to be permanently shaped by whatever happens next." Astrid closed her eyes, trying to process information that challenged everything she had built her peace upon. She had learned to accept her children's absence because she believed they were building better lives elsewhere. The knowledge that Ingrid was suffering, that her grandchildren were suffering, while she and Eirik had been focused on their own happiness, felt like a betrayal of everything motherhood meant. Where? Eirik's single word carried the promise of action. 3 days hard travel southeast near the mouth of the Geiranger Fjord. The Jarl's Hall sits on a prominence overlooking the water. Impossible to miss if you know the landmarks. We have to go to her, Astrid said, the decision forming as she spoke. We have to bring her home. It's not that simple, Bjorn warned. Her late husband's family has legal claim over her through their grandchildren. Taking her without permission would be considered theft, punishable by outlawry or death. You'd need to prove they violated their duty of care or find some way to negotiate her release. What would that take? Silver, lots of it, or some service they value more than the satisfaction of controlling her life. The trader shrugged. Rich families don't usually give up their property without significant compensation. Property. Their daughter had become property, a possession to be bartered or controlled rather than a person with rights and dignity. The injustice of it made Astrid's vision blur with rage. There's more news, Bjorn said quietly, and something in his tone made them both look up sharply. About your youngest son. Astrid's heart stopped. After Magnus's death and Ingrid's suffering, she wasn't sure she could bear whatever came next. Olaf is alive. The simple statement hit them like lightning. After 2 years of wondering and worrying, of imagining him dead in some western sea or lost beyond all possibility of return, the confirmation that their youngest child still breathed was almost too much to process. Where? Eirik demanded. Coastal settlement called Hafrsfjord, about a week's journey north of here. He's been there for 6 months, recovering from injuries sustained in a shipwreck that destroyed the vessel carrying his exploration party. Injuries. Astrid's voice came out small, badly broken leg that healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp. Some internal damage that makes long journeys dangerous for him. He's alive and well-minded, but he can't make the trek home on his own. Why didn't he send word sooner? Eirik asked, because he believed his family was dead. The last news he received, years ago, said his father had fallen in battle and his mother had died of grief the following winter. He's been living as an exile, convinced he had no home to return to. The cruelty of it, that Olaf had been grieving parents who were alive while they had been mourning him as lost, felt like a cosmic joke played by malicious gods. How many years had they all spent in unnecessary sorrow, separated by false information and failed communication? He's working as a carpenter and navigator for hire, Bjorn continued. Good reputation among the coastal traders, but he speaks often of family he'll never see again. The settlement folk say he's a man haunted by homesickness for a place that no longer exists. Astrid felt the walls of her carefully rebuilt world cracking under the weight of this new information. For a month, she and Eirik had been focused inward, healing their marriage and preparing for a quiet winter together. Now the wider world was demanding their attention, calling them to action that would require leaving their sanctuary and risking everything they had rebuilt. We have to choose, she said, voicing the terrible decision that faced them. Stay here and preserve what we've found together, or leave and try to rescue the children we thought we'd lost forever. That's not a choice, Eirik said firmly. That's just fear talking. We go after them, both of them. We bring our family home, and if we lose everything in the attempt, if we fail to save Ingrid and end up outlawed, if we reach Olaf only to find he doesn't want to be rescued, if we destroy what we've built here for the sake of what we might not be able to achieve there, then we fail together instead of living safely apart. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the valley that had been their refuge. 20 years ago, I chose duty over family and lost everything that mattered. I won't make that mistake again, but in reverse. What do you mean? I mean, I won't choose our comfort over our children's welfare. I won't let fear of losing what we have prevent us from doing what we must. Bjorn cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "There's one more thing you should know before you decide. I didn't come here just to bring news. I came to offer services. For the right price, I can guide you to both your children. I know the political situation around Ingrid's predicament, and I have contacts in Hafrsfjord who can help with Olaf's situation." "What's your price?" Astrid asked. "Transport and supplies for the journey, plus a silver arm ring when we return successfully. I've got my own reasons for wanting to see justice done. I knew your Magnus before he died. Good lad, deserved better than what he got. You knew Magnus." Eirik's voice carried the hunger of a parent starved for any connection to his lost son, fought beside him in his last battle. He died bravely, trying to save wounded comrades. Spoke of his family often, wondered if he'd made his parents proud. Bjorn's weathered face softened. "I promised him that if I ever passed this way, I'd bring word to his mother. Took me 3 years to fulfill that promise, but here I am. The news about Magnus, that he had died well, that he had remembered them at the end, provided comfort Astrid hadn't realized she needed. But it also strengthened her resolve to save the children who might still be saved. When would we leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you're willing. The weather's still favorable for travel, but that won't last much longer. Wait until spring, and you might find very different situations waiting for you." Astrid looked around the longhouse that had been her prison and sanctuary, her burden and her home. Leaving it felt like betraying 20 years of stubborn survival, but staying felt like betraying the children who needed them now. "What do you think?" she asked Eirik. "I think we've spent enough time hiding from the world, while our family suffered beyond our sight." He returned to the table and took her hands in his. "I think love requires action, not just feeling. I think we go." "All right then." She squeezed his hands, drawing strength from his certainty. "We go." It was perhaps the most frightening decision she had made since choosing to let Eirik back into her life, but it felt right in a way that safety for its own sake never had. They were choosing to be a family again, with all the risk and responsibility that entailed. The quiet life they had built would wait for their return. Their children would not. Astrid's mother's ring caught the morning light as she pressed it into her palm one final time before tucking it safely into her travel pouch. The simple gold band had been passed down through 5 generations of women, each of whom had faced moments when everything familiar had to be left behind for the sake of what mattered most. The departure preparations had taken most of the night. What did you pack when leaving a home you might never see again? What did you take when weight mattered, but sentiment pulled at every small treasure accumulated over decades of careful survival? In the end, she had chosen practicality over nostalgia. Warm clothes, basic tools, preserved food, and a few items that carried the essence of family history without burdening them with unnecessary weight. The ring had been the hardest decision, but also the most important. It represented the unbroken chain of mothers who had loved their children enough to risk everything for their welfare. "Ready?" Eirik asked, shouldering his own pack with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to travel light and fast. "No," she said honestly, "but ready enough." They stood together in the doorway of the longhouse, looking back at the space that had witnessed their family's joy, destruction, and tentative rebuilding. The repaired roof, the straightened walls, the small garden plot, all evidence of their partnership in creating something stable from ruins. "It will be here when we return," Eirik said, reading her thoughts. "If we return, when we return," he corrected firmly. "With our children." Bjorn waited by his pack animals with the patient air of someone accustomed to emotional farewells. His mules stood loaded with supplies for the journey, their breath steaming in the cold morning air as winter approached with inevitable certainty. "First destination is Hafrsfjord," the trader announced as they joined him. "Olaf is the easier rescue. No legal complications, just a matter of convincing a homesick man that he has family waiting for him. Plus, having him along will help when we deal with Ingrid's situation. Nothing carries more weight in family disputes than the presence of adult male relatives." The journey began with the careful steps of people leaving security behind for uncertainty. Astrid found herself looking back repeatedly during the first hour, watching their valley disappear behind ridges and forests until even the smoke from their banked hearth fire was lost to distance. "Second thoughts?" Eirik asked, falling into step beside her as they followed Bjorn's steady pace. "Constant thoughts, but not changing thoughts." She adjusted her pack straps, already feeling the weight that would only grow heavier with miles. "I keep thinking about Ingrid as a little girl, how she used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms frightened her. How can I sit in comfort while she's afraid and powerless? And I keep thinking about how I've already lost 20 years with our children. I won't lose whatever time remains by choosing safety over action." The first day's travel took them through familiar territory. Hills and forests she had seen from the longhouse, paths she had walked during her years of solitary survival. But as afternoon wore toward evening, they moved beyond the boundaries of her known world into landscapes that existed only in trader stories and distant rumors. "Tell me about Olaf," she said to Bjorn as they made camp beside a clear stream. "What's he like now? How has he changed?" "Still clever as a fox and twice as curious," the trader replied, building their fire with practiced efficiency. "But there's a sadness to him that wasn't there in the stories his family told. He smiles when he talks about the lands he's seen, the marvels beyond the western waters, but his eyes go distant when he thinks no one is watching." "What kind of sadness?" "The kind that comes from achieving your dreams and discovering they're not enough to fill the holes left by what you gave up to get them." Bjorn arranged stones around the fire pit. He'd seen wonders that would make skalds weep, but he'd trade them all for one more evening by his family's hearth. That night, sleeping under stars with forest sounds, replacing the familiar creaking of their longhouse timbers, Astrid dreamed of her youngest son as she had last seen him, 16 years old, carving his navigation stone by firelight while planning adventures that would take him to the edge of the world. In the dream, he looked up from his work and asked why she had let him go so far away. "Because I thought that's what love meant," Dream Astrid replied. "Letting you choose your own path, even when it led away from home. Sometimes love means coming after someone who's lost their way back," Dream Olaf said. And when she woke, his words seemed less like imagination than prophecy. The second day brought them to the coastal regions where salt air replaced the crisp scent of mountain forests. Astrid had never seen the ocean before, and the vast expanse of grey water stretching to the horizon filled her with a mixture of awe and unease. This was the element that had called to Olaf, the pathway to adventure that had taken him beyond her reach. "Hafrsfjord is just ahead," Bjorn announced as they crested a ridge that revealed a natural harbour filled with vessels of every size and description. Settlement grew up around the protected anchorage. Traders, shipbuilders, folks who make their living from the sea, and those who sail it. The settlement bustled with activity despite the approaching winter. Ships prepared for final voyages before the weather turned dangerous, merchants haggled over cargoes, and skilled craftsmen worked on repairs that would keep vessels seaworthy through the harsh months ahead. "How do we find him?" Astrid asked, overwhelmed by the crowds and noise after years of solitary living. "We ask," Bjorn said simply. "Small community like this, everyone knows everyone. Plus, a crippled navigator with stories of Western land stands out in any crowd." It took less than an hour to locate Olaf. A shipwright pointed them toward a workshop near the harbour's edge where a man was carving replacement oars with the focused intensity of someone who understood that poor craftsmanship, who could mean death at sea. Astrid's first glimpse of her youngest son after 2 years of uncertainty stopped her in her tracks. He was thin, weathered by sun and salt air, his left leg clearly damaged in ways that would never fully heal. But his hands moved over the wood with the same careful precision she remembered, and his profile still carried the thoughtful expression that had marked him as different from his more obviously ambitious siblings. "Olaf," she called softly, afraid that speaking his name too loudly might make this moment disappear like so many dreams. He looked up, his carving tool freezing in mid-stroke as his eyes found hers across the busy workshop. For a heartbeat she saw confusion, disbelief, the careful skepticism of someone who had been disappointed too often to trust hope immediately. Then recognition dawned, and the careful control that had held him together through years of exile crumbled into something raw and desperate. Mother? She was across the workshop and holding him before conscious thought could intervene, her arms wrapping around shoulders that trembled with the force of emotions too long suppressed. He felt smaller than she remembered, worn down by hardship and loss, but undeniably alive and unmistakably her son. "I thought you were dead," he whispered against her shoulder. "I heard. Someone said, 'We're here,'" she said, her voice thick with tears she hadn't expected. "We're alive and we've come to take you home." Home? He pulled back to look at her face, as if checking for signs that this might be hallucination or cruel joke. But the longhouse, the valley, still there, still ours, still waiting for family to fill it again. Behind her, Eirik stepped forward with the careful movements of a man approaching a spooked animal. 20 years was a long time in the life of someone who had been 13 when his father disappeared, and she could see Olaf struggling to reconcile memory with the scarred, greying man before him. Father. The word came out tentative, testing, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to claim the relationship. Son. Eirik's response carried no hesitation, only the profound relief of a man who had feared this reunion would never come. "I'm sorry it took so long to find you." The embrace between father and son was different from the desperate clinging she and Olaf had shared, more careful, weighted with the knowledge that they were essentially strangers who happened to share blood and history. But it was a beginning, a foundation they could build upon during the journey home. "How did you find me?" Olaf asked when they had settled in the workshop's corner to share news and make plans. "Bjorn brought word," Astrid said, nodding toward the trader who had tactfully withdrawn to examine ship construction techniques. "We learned you were alive and injured, unable to make the journey home alone. And we learned that Ingrid needs our help," Eirik added. "Her situation has become desperate." As they explained what they knew about their daughter's circumstances, Astrid watched her son's face harden with the controlled anger of someone who understood powerlessness intimately. His years of exile had taught him what it meant to be alone and vulnerable in a world that cared nothing for individual suffering. "How long before we can leave?" Olaf asked, already beginning to gather his few possessions. "Tomorrow morning, if you're able to travel," Bjorn said, rejoining their circle. "The weather's holding for now, but winter storms could trap us if we delay much longer." "I can travel," Olaf said firmly, though Astrid noticed how carefully he shifted weight off his damaged leg. "I've been ready to go home for 2 years. I just didn't know there was still a home to return to." That evening, as they shared a meal in the settlement's communal hall, Astrid found herself studying her son's face in the firelight. He had grown into someone she barely recognized, not the eager boy who had sailed away seeking adventure, but a man marked by experiences that had taught him the price of wandering too far from those who loved him. "Tell me about the Western lands," she said, genuinely curious about the dreams that had called him away. "Green islands where the soil is rich enough to grow anything, where no one fights over territory, because there's more than enough for everyone who wants to work for it." His eyes grew distant with memory. Forests full of trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky, rivers teeming with fish, land free for the claiming by anyone brave enough to build something lasting. It sounds wonderful. It was. But wonderful places mean nothing if you have no one to share them with, no family to write letters to, no home to return to with stories. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I spent 2 years in paradise, and all I could think about was sitting by our fire, listening to you weave, while Father told the same old stories about his grandfather's raids. And now I want to go save my sister, and help you decide whether that paradise might be worth visiting together as a family. When the world grows safer for such journeys, The suggestion surprised her, not because it was unreasonable, but because it represented hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival. They were already planning beyond the immediate crisis, already imagining adventures they might share as a reunited family. "First Ingrid," Eirik said, raising his ale cup in a toast. "Then we'll see what tomorrow brings." "First Ingrid," they agreed in unison, the words carrying the weight of an oath as they prepared for sleep in the settlement's guest house. Astrid reflected on how quickly their simple plan had grown complex. They had left home intending to rescue 2 lost children. Now they were 3 adults planning a mission that would require diplomacy, strategy, and perhaps courage in the face of open conflict. But for the first time in 20 years, they were facing the unknown as a family. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. The wooden doll lay forgotten in the corner of Ingrid's cramped hut, its painted face worn smooth by years of love from small hands. Astrid picked it up with trembling fingers, recognizing the toy she had carved for her. Daughter's 5th birthday, the same daughter, who now sat before them with hollow eyes and children, clinging to her ragged skirts. The journey to find Ingrid had taken 3 days through increasingly hostile terrain. As they approached the Jarl's settlement near Geiranger Fjord, the signs of wealth and power had grown more obvious. Well-maintained roads, prosperous farms, and finally, the imposing hall that dominated the coastline like a stone fortress. But Ingrid wasn't in the main hall. They found her in a servant's hut behind the kitchens, living in conditions that made Astrid's 20 years of solitude seem luxurious by comparison. "Mother?" Ingrid's voice cracked with disbelief as she looked up from the meager fire where she was heating thin gruel for her children. Why are you here?" The reunion was heartbreaking in its restraint. Years of powerlessness had taught Ingrid to guard her emotions, to hope for nothing that could be taken away. Even seeing her parents alive and present, she moved with the careful wariness of someone who had learned that joy was a luxury she couldn't afford. "We've come to take you home," Astrid said, kneeling beside her daughter and reaching for the children who pressed against Ingrid's sides like frightened animals. "This is Bjorn," Ingrid whispered, indicating the 8-year-old boy, whose serious eyes held too much knowledge for his age. "And little Astrid, named for you." The girl was 5 years old, with her mother's golden hair and her grandmother's stubborn chin. Both children stared at these strangers who claimed family connection, uncertain whether to hope or hide. "Home?" Ingrid shook her head slowly. "There is no home for us. Harold's family owns us now, owns our lives and our future. We can't just leave." "Yes, we can," Eirik said firmly. But Astrid could see him taking in the reality of their daughter's situation, the bruises on her arms, the fear in her children's eyes, the way she flinched when footsteps approached the hut. "You don't understand," Ingrid said urgently. "They've made it clear what happens to me if I resist their plans. Bjorn Haraldsson wants me as his wife, and what Bjorn wants, he gets. If I refuse, my children lose even this shelter. If I run, they'll hunt us down and—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but her meaning was clear enough. "We're not children anymore, Ingrid," Olaf said gently, settling beside his sister with careful movements that accommodated his damaged leg. "We're a family with resources and allies. You don't have to face this alone, Olaf." Ingrid's composure cracked slightly as she recognized her younger brother despite the changes 2 years had wrought. "But you were supposed to be— Everyone said you were lost at sea." "I was lost in many ways," he admitted. "But I'm found now, and we're all here to bring you home." Through the hut's single window, they could see the main hall where Harold's family was undoubtedly planning their next move in the campaign to force Ingrid's compliance. Time was running short. Their arrival hadn't gone unnoticed, and soon they would face confrontation whether they sought it or not. "What's their legal claim?" Bjorn asked, speaking for the first time since they had entered the hut. As a trader, he understood the complexities of law and custom that governed family disputes. "The children," Ingrid said bitterly. "As Harold's grandchildren, they have rights to inheritance and protection. But those rights come with obligations, obedience, loyalty, acceptance of family decisions about marriage and future. I'm just the vessel that carried them, not a person with independent rights. That's one interpretation of the law, Bjorn said thoughtfully, but not the only one. If we can prove neglect or abuse, if we can demonstrate that your birth family is better positioned to provide care and protection, with what evidence? Ingrid interrupted. Look around you. They'll point to our ragged clothes, our lack of property, our status as wanderers without permanent settlement. How does that compare to a Jarl's hall and established wealth? Astrid felt the weight of her daughter's despair, but also the stirring of anger that had carried her through 20 years of survival against impossible odds. Harold's family might have legal advantages and material wealth, but they had underestimated the determination of parents who had already lost too much. We'll think of something, she said with more confidence than she felt. We didn't come this far to be turned away by bullies who hide behind law when it suits them and ignore it when it doesn't. Mother, you can't fight these people. They have power, connections, the ability to destroy anyone who challenges them. And we have something they don't, Eirik said quietly. We have the truth about how they've treated you and your children. We have witnesses who can testify to neglect and abuse. Most importantly, we have the love that brought us here against all odds. Outside, voices were approaching. Harsh male tones discussing the unexpected visitors who had somehow found their way to the forbidden hut. The confrontation Astrid had been dreading was about to begin. What do we do? Ingrid asked, pulling her children closer as fear overtook the tentative hope their arrival had sparked. We face them together, Astrid said, standing and smoothing her travel-worn clothes as if preparing for battle. We tell the truth and demand justice. We trust that sometimes right matters more than might, and if they refuse to listen, then we make them listen. The footsteps stopped outside their door, followed by the kind of silence that preceded either negotiation or violence. Astrid looked around at her family, her husband scarred by 20 years of hardship, her son marked by exile and injury, her daughter worn down by years of powerlessness, and felt a fierce pride in what they had survived to reach this moment. They were no longer the prosperous clan that had once dominated their valley, but they were still a family, still people who chose love over safety, who risked everything for those who mattered most. The door burst open without ceremony, revealing 3 men whose expensive clothes and confident bearing marked them as Harold's representatives. The largest of them, clearly Bjorn Haraldsson himself, surveyed the crowded hut with the disdain of someone examining livestock. So, he said, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of absolute power, the widow's mysterious family has finally appeared. How convenient. The family shield hung heavy on Eirik's arm, its painted surface telling the story of 3 generations through symbols that spoke of honor, courage, and protection of kin. He had retrieved it from their longhouse before departure, knowing that this moment would require every symbol of authority they could claim. I am Eirik Thorsson, he announced, stepping forward to place himself between Bjorn Haraldsson and his family. This is my wife Astrid, my son Olaf, and my daughter Ingrid. We've come to reclaim what belongs to us. Bjorn Haraldsson laughed, but the sound carried no humor, only the cruel amusement of someone who enjoyed watching others struggle against impossible odds. Your daughter belongs to this family now, old man, as do her children. Whatever claim you think you have died with her husband, the law says otherwise, Olaf interjected, moving to stand beside his father, despite his damaged leg. A woman's birth family retains rights when her husband's family fails in their duty of care. Duty of care. The second man, whom Bjorn addressed as Uncle Grim, sneered at the suggestion. She has shelter, food, protection. What more does any woman need? Dignity? Astrid said quietly, but her voice carried the steel that had sustained her through 20 years of solitary survival. Respect, the right to make choices about her own life and her children's future. Touching sentiment from a family of beggars, Bjorn said, his eyes cataloguing their travel-worn clothes and humble appearance. But sentiment doesn't override law, and law is clear. Ingrid remains here, as do the children. My proposal of marriage stands. She can accept it willingly or have it imposed upon her, but either way, she stays. The casual cruelty of the ultimatum filled the small hut with tension, thick enough to taste. Astrid could feel her daughter trembling beside her, caught between impossible choices that offered only different forms of suffering. "There's another way," Bjorn the trader said, speaking up from his position near the door. "Trial by community judgment. Let the people of this settlement hear both sides and decide where justice lies. The people of this settlement depend on my family's goodwill for their prosperity," Bjorn Haraldsson replied dismissively. "They'll vote whichever way serves their interests best." "Maybe," the trader agreed. "But they'll also hear testimony about how you've treated a widow and her children. They'll see the bruises, hear about the threats, witness the fear in those children's eyes. Sometimes even self-interest has limits." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Bjorn's features. His confidence rested on the assumption that his family's power made opposition impossible. But public scrutiny might reveal behavior that even his allies would find difficult to defend. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked the absolute certainty it had carried moments before. "Call the assembly," Eirik said, raising his shield so the family symbols caught the afternoon light. "Let the community decide whether justice lies with those who claim ownership over the powerless, or with those who offer love and protection freely given." "This is ridiculous," Uncle Grim snarled. "We don't negotiate with vagrants who have no standing in this community." "We have standing as Ingrid's blood family," Astrid said firmly. "We have standing as grandparents seeking to protect children from those who see them as property rather than people. Most importantly, we have standing as human beings, appealing to other human beings for justice." The confrontation might have escalated into violence, if not for the crowd that had begun gathering outside the hut. Word of the family dispute had spread through the settlement with the speed that such drama always achieved, and curious faces pressed close to witness whatever would unfold. "What's the delay?" called a voice from the crowd. "If there's law to be discussed, let it be done properly, in assembly where all can hear." "Yes," agreed another voice. "Let's hear what these travelers claim, and what evidence they bring." Bjorn Haraldsson found himself trapped between his desire to end this challenge immediately and his need to maintain the appearance of lawful authority. To refuse community judgment would suggest he feared what such scrutiny might reveal. "Very well," he said through gritted teeth. "Assembly at sunset. But when this farce is finished and my authority confirmed, there will be consequences for those who wasted the community's time with false accusations." As the crowd dispersed to spread word of the coming assembly, Astrid gathered her family close in the cramped hut that had been Ingrid's prison. "Can we win?" Ingrid whispered, hope and terror warring in her voice. "We can tell the truth," Astrid replied. "Sometimes that's enough, and if it isn't..." Eirik hefted his shield, testing its balance with movements that spoke of muscle memory older than his scars. "Then we face whatever comes as a family. No one stands alone anymore." As afternoon moved toward evening, they prepared their case like warriors preparing for battle, organizing testimony, gathering evidence, steeling themselves for a confrontation that would determine not just Ingrid's fate, but the future of their painfully reunited family. The community assembly would be their battlefield, words their weapons, and justice their hoped-for victory. But win or lose, they would face it together, as they should have faced everything all along. "Whatever happens," Astrid said, as they prepared to leave the hut for the assembly ground, "we don't let them separate us again." "Never again," they agreed, the words carrying the weight of an oath sworn in blood and sealed with love. The new family tapestry stretched across Astrid's loom like a map of their journey home, its threads telling a story that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Golden strands from Ingrid's hair, silver from her own, deep brown from Eirik's beard, and bright copper from little Astrid's curls, all woven together in patterns that spoke of separation overcome and bonds reforged. Spring had come early to their coastal settlement, the new home they had built where fjord met sea, where Olaf's navigation skills could flourish and Ingrid's children could grow up free from the shadows of their past. The community assembly had ruled in their favor that autumn evening, swayed by testimony that revealed the depths of Bjorn Haraldsson's cruelty and the obvious love that had driven a family to risk everything for reunion. "Tell me the story again." "Grandmother," 8-year-old Bjorn said, settling beside her loom with the patient attention of a child who never tired of hearing about how his family had been saved. "Which part would you like to hear?" Astrid asked, her fingers working golden thread into the section that represented their daughter's liberation. "The part where your grandfather faced down 3 armed men with nothing but words and righteousness? Or the part where your mother stood before the entire assembly and spoke her truth without fear?" "The part where you came for us," 5-year-old Astrid whispered, leaning against her grandmother's knee. "The part where you didn't leave us behind." "Ah, that part," Astrid smiled, remembering the moment when the community had voted to grant them custody, when Bjorn Haraldsson's face had gone purple with rage and impotent fury. "Well, it began with a wooden doll that reminded me that some things are too precious to abandon. Through the window of their new longhouse, smaller than the old one, but built with the combined skills of 3 generations, she could see Eirik and Olaf working on a fishing boat that would serve both practical needs and her son's desire to explore the coastal waters. Their relationship had grown stronger through months of shared labor, the awkwardness of reunification replaced by genuine respect and affection. Ingrid appeared in the doorway, her face bearing the peaceful expression of someone who had learned to sleep without fear. 6 months of good food, honest work, and the security of family protection had transformed her from the hollow-eyed woman they had found in that servant's hut. "The children are asking if we can visit the green lands Uncle Olaf discovered," she said, settling beside her mother with the comfortable ease of someone who knew she belonged. "And what did you tell them?" "That adventure is more fun when you have a home to return to afterward." Ingrid picked up her own needle, adding her contribution to the tapestry that would someday hang in the place of honor above their hearth. "That maybe next spring, when the boat is finished and the sailing season opens, we might take a family expedition to see what wonders lie beyond the horizon." The suggestion would have terrified Astrid a year ago, the idea of risking their hard-won stability for the uncertain promises of exploration. But the woman who had spent 20 years afraid of losing what little she had was gone, replaced by someone who understood that love grew stronger when shared with adventure rather than hoarded in isolation. "Your father would like that," she said. "He's been talking about seeing those lands where no one fights over territory, where families can build whatever they dream of building. And you? I think I'd like to see what called to Olaf so strongly. I think I'd like to understand what dreams look like when they're big enough to sail toward." As evening approached, their extended family gathered around the table that had been crafted from driftwood and determination. Eirik at the head, his scars now badges of survival rather than marks of shame. Olaf beside him, his limp barely noticeable after months of healing in the loving attention of family. Ingrid across from her brother, her children flanking her like small guardians who had learned that protection could be found in love rather than fear. "What news from the traders?" Astrid asked as they shared the evening meal that had become their daily celebration of togetherness. "Ships preparing for spring voyages," Olaf reported. "Some heading east toward the trading cities, others west toward the Greenlands. A few captains have asked if I'd be interested in serving as navigator for expeditions to map the coastal routes." "Interested?" Eirik asked. "Only if it's a family expedition," Olaf replied. "I've had enough of adventures that take me away from the people who matter most." Little Astrid looked up from her bowl with the serious expression that marked her as her grandmother's true descendant. "Will we all go together?" "If we go at all, we go together," Astrid confirmed. "That's what families do. They face the unknown as a unit. They share both the dangers and the discoveries, and they always come home," Bjorn added, with the wisdom of someone who had learned early that belonging was more valuable than any treasure. That night, as she and Eirik prepared for sleep in the room they had shared since autumn, Astrid reflected on the journey that had brought them from the ruins of their old life to the promise of whatever came next. "Any regrets?" Eirik asked, the question that had become their evening ritual. "About leaving the valley. About risking everything we'd built for the possibility of saving our children. About choosing love over safety." She considered each decision that had led them to this moment. No regrets, only gratitude. For what? For learning that home isn't a place you protect by staying put. Home is something you build wherever your family gathers, something you carry with you wherever love leads. She nestled against his warmth, listening to the gentle sounds of their household, settling into sleep, children's voices whispering across the hall, Olaf humming as he worked on navigation charts for their potential spring voyage. Ingrid moving quietly through evening tasks that she now performed by choice rather than compulsion. Outside their window, spring stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided travelers for countless generations. Tomorrow would bring new decisions about how far to venture from the safety they had created, how much risk to accept in pursuit of dreams that might prove as valuable as the love that had already carried them so far. But tonight, they were complete. Tonight, the family that had been scattered by war and loss and the simple passage of time was whole again, stronger for having been broken and rebuilt through conscious choice rather than mere circumstance. The tapestry on her loom waited for morning's work, its unfinished sections holding space for whatever stories the future would write. But the part that mattered most, the foundation, that showed a family choosing each other again and again, was already woven in threads that would never break. Astrid's last conscious thought was about the navigation stone in her bedside chest, Olaf's gift that had helped her find direction when she thought she was permanently lost. Perhaps the truest navigation wasn't about reading stars or following charts, but about recognizing that sometimes the path home led through territory you'd never imagined traveling. Sometimes finding your way meant having the courage to lose yourself completely, trusting that love would be compass enough to guide you back to where you belonged.